I am thrilled to bring out for a longer dive into some of the points he touched on this morning, Matti Schneider. Open source encourages collaboration and builds shared products for the public good, which is a great start. But what about data? From OpenStreetMap to Creative Commons to Wikimedia to Common Crawl, the Digital Commons is data's version of open source, public resources on which we can build services by, of, and for the people. Matti, who you met earlier this morning, is the Director of Product and Collaboration at OpenFisca. And when I had a look at OpenFisca's site, it kind of blew my mind because it lets users model government rules, calculate the costs and benefits of legislation, and effectively turn law into code where it can be analyzed by and for everyone. Matti is here to dive deeper into the topics he touched on this morning. Hi, Matti. How you doing?
Hi. Very well. We had the most uplifting music ever for the last 2 minutes. That really got me started.
It's so great. I mean, hopefully we get to see you here in Canada or indeed wherever you happen to be. And I love the fact that you spent a year like traveling the world just to see what's working. I think we so seldom take time to look at that. That's one of the things I love about running this conference every year is just the cross-pollination of ideas. You know, we were talking a couple of years ago about the digital divide, and Audrey Tang said, you know, a lot of people give these great platitudes. So Audrey was like, oh, yes, and, you know, some people don't have access to broadband. Every politician says that. But then Audrey says, so I went and lived in different communities for a week at a time and tried to do my job. You come back from that, and you're like, yeah, that's a real problem. It makes it very realistic. And I think just seeing these kinds of ideas, what Laura was talking about with Etalab when she was saying to me when we spoke earlier this year, they embed a nerd with every minister who kind of walks around and then comes back after a meeting and goes, hey, by the way, that thing they were talking about, if you just change these 3 lines of legislation, we can implement it in a week, which is something that we seldom hear. So I love the idea that we can cross-pollinate these ideas across different governments. And obviously your travels around the world to do that were a good start. Where did you visit during that trip?
Well, there were quite a few stops where it was just visiting, actually, and discovering more of a local entities and civil society. But I did end up working with the New Zealand government for quite a few months. That's where I helped deploy OpenFisca. So this tool was built initially to model tax and benefit systems for economic reasons, and ended up being used within the French government to deliver products targeting companies and citizens. And after spending a few months investing in making this tool more reusable, paving the way towards it becoming a common rather than just a piece of open source software, I was lucky enough to have this opportunity to meet the Government Service Innovation Lab folks in New Zealand who wanted to deliver quite a similar tool, a benefits assessment tool for their own citizens. And having OpenFisca right at hand with the years of experiences consolidated in it enabled us to deliver a prototype within barely a few weeks. And nowadays, OpenFisca is used in several countries around the world, especially in the Pacific region, thanks to this pollination happening there. And we now have contributors that come from all around the world, of course, because they are using this piece of software because it makes sense for them to use it. And they contribute changes and improvements. One specific example that I like to give is how some assumptions were made with time frames. For example, legislation in France and in most of Europe relies on years and months. And there in New Zealand, as well as in Australia, most of the payment systems are based on weeks. And it was quite a deep change in the system that we could never have anticipated. So that sort of changes are always extremely interesting and question some of the fundamentals, but also enable for better service in the end.
Yeah, I think that idea of first you got to globalize, then localize any product makes you realize just how many assumptions we take for granted. We think they're rules, but they're actually just assumptions or local decisions. We had Chris Taggart from Open Corporates a couple of years ago talking about this kind of stuff and the data that's in there. So it's so great to me to see this landscape of open services that can be built atop public data like this. I don't want to steal your time. You're here to talk to us about building digital commons. So I'm going to be back here when you're done just to say goodbye and thank you. And then we're going to head you over to the Q&A lab. So you're going to talk until 2 Eastern time, which is roughly 35 minutes left. And then you're going to head over to Q&A in Wonder, and people can ask you questions there. So if you got questions for Matti while he's speaking, save them up, write them down, and then you can rush the stage virtually and have those conversations afterwards. So take it away, Matti.
Thank you so much, Alistair. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. This workshop will start with a very short brief on what digital commons are, just enough so we can go straight into the fully active part where you will be doing all the work. If you attended my keynote session 2 hours ago, please hold on just for 2 minutes while I give a very quick recap. My name is Matti Schneider. I worked for the general interest in both private sector, NGOs and startups, and public sector with innovation labs with several governments, as we just saw with Alistair. And I now work on transitioning 2 services from publicly operated into digital commons, OpenFiscal, which we touched on, and Open Terms Archive, which aims at rebalancing power between big tech and public actors by making a publicly available archive of all the terms of services of digital services. In this workshop, I will introduce you to the framework that I built to provide both the teams and the public owners of these 2 pieces of software with a clear roadmap towards full commons governance. Indeed, digital commons are just standard digital services from the point of view of the user. That is, they are apps or social and technical systems that deliver value to humans through interaction with software, the sort of stuff you use every day. What sets them apart, though, is commons governance. Governance is the definition of who and how decisions are taken. In commons governance, all decisions are taken democratically within the community of users and contributors. But decisions on what exactly and how are they taken? This is what we will focus on for this workshop. The different aspects of a digital service on which specific rules should be applied to maximize reusability and decrease the risk of reappropriation are many. So we tend to think of software as open source being enough or open data being enough. But actually, there are quite a few risks if you try to create a common governance. So we'll go through what I call components of these services and go from the most operational ones to the more strategic ones and assess the risks for reappropriation. That is, the risks that one actor within the ecosystem of users and contributors just captures the value that is flowing throughout the ecosystem, drains it away from other users, and potentially kills that resource that was bringing so much value to everyone. That's enough for the theory now. So first of all, source code. Of course, digital services are first and foremost pieces of software. So the machine executable code that enables the product to exist is a fundamental component. And if that component is not made publicly available, is not potentially changeable, modifiable by others, that means that the actor that handles the source code might just decide to change it unilaterally, and all the users and contributors would be left stranded because they don't have a say in this. All right, so this is open source. I think you know where I'm getting at. If you apply legally constraining licenses on this source code, you will limit most of the risks of your appropriation. That was the simple one, the most common one. Let's go into terms. The terms of usage, the terms of service for services also enable risk or can mitigate it. If you have terms that can be changed unilaterally by any entity, the one that is operating the service, then at any point they might take away from you the right to use the software as you see fit. So you have to make sure that if you want to enable commons governance, you have constraints, you have rules that will make sure that the terms don't prevent any specific actor from using that service. The data, be it the user-provided data, such as in Wikipedia or OpenStreetMap, or the databases on which the service provides its value, all of them are extremely important, and they might be delivered independently from the service, actually. If they are not, if they are captured, then you might have an open source, a piece of open source software that only provides value when it is plugged in proprietary data, preventing its value from being reusable. A bit farther away and more unusual, the statistics of usage. If one specific entity has access to all the data that is provided just by the interaction between the user and the service, they might know which features work best, which features need more work, and they might create an alternative to the common good that you're trying to create that would focus on a specific niche, on a subset of the community and drag it away from the main commons. That would potentially create fragmentation that would then decrease a lot the value that is in the main common. The means for communication within the community and towards the external world are once again an important component. Let's say, for example, one single entity has access to a newsletter or to the way to communicate critical information to all the community. They might very well say that, oh, by the way, we are closing down this service, but you could use this alternative. And this is not a purely theoretical example. This actually happened a few years ago with TrueCrypt, a piece of software that enabled full disk encryption on Windows system. And to this day, it is still unexplained how the main developers of TrueCrypt at some point sent an email to the entire community saying, by the way, TrueCrypt is not secure anymore. You should use Windows provided tools. We still don't know what happened. There were some alternatives that were built, but the comment that was there, the piece of software that enabled value for so many people, just disappeared, was replaced by some alternatives. But means of communication are clearly a way to direct all of the community to one place or another. For comments that rely on contribution and usage, this can be fatal. The branding elements are just the same. Even if there is no specific logo, there's always a name or a domain name that are associated with the service. If one single entity controls it, they can just direct the traffic from one place to the other, or might just reuse the logo for something entirely different, reusing the reputation that was built with one brand, pretending that it is still common when actually they are just using it for themselves. Finally, the allocation of resources and how features are prioritized are once again a component that might enable reappropriation if it is not properly protected. What if some entity decides to always favor features that bring value to a subset of the community? At some point, the digital common that was of use to a wider community might just be focused on a subset, removing substance for most of the others. So these are the 7 components on which we will be working for this workshop. I will describe the sort of constraints that should be put on the rules, that should be applied on the rules for these components, so that decision-making stays democratic and is not taken away from the community. Once again, let's start with the most common example of source code. I will not recommend any specific license because I don't believe there's one-size-fits-all solution. However, it is certain that if you don't go for a license that enables wide reuse and modification and redistribution, then you're probably not going to be able to protect your common from reappropriation. So that's for source code, right? Open source is very well known. Now let's go to the terms. What exactly should be put in the terms? Once again, I won't recommend you one template for terms of service, but I can say that if you have restrictions on who can use the software or the service or in which use cases, then you are less likely to have reusability and you are more likely to have one actor adding specific constraints that would prevent reusability. The data itself, be it user-provided data or databases that enable the value to be delivered, should be distributed also under free licenses, independently from the source code. The statistics of usage, once again, more unusual, should be made publicly available so that anyone can understand how the service works, how it is actually used, and not just in theory. And potentially, the database of these interactions should also be made available under a free license, enabling mining, enabling finer understanding, and potentially creation of alternatives. Means of communication should at least be representative of community opinions and enable discussions, not being kept within one entity. Potentially, some tools might be used to ensure that social media or emails can be sent by different actors and not just suggested to one actor to be sent. The branding elements should be licensed, that is, they should be copyrighted to prevent the actor that created them to enforce one sort of usage, but then be easily reusable through a charter, saying, for example, as long as you truthfully represent the tool and what it is and what it does, you are very, very welcome to use these branding elements for yourself without asking for prior permission. This would both maximize reusability and prevent reappropriation, prevent one actor from using that for their own benefit. And finally, the commons decision-making in strategy would be achieved by transparency on resource allocation, that is understanding how the shared resources are used within the community, and the community should have a say in which priorities and how priorities are defined. That does not mean that there would be a big get-together and designed by committee with potentially 3,000 people, but at least there should be mechanisms to make sure that the shared resources are allocated in ways that make sense for the wider community. So this was a presentation of the constraints that should be put on actual rules. Now let's go one step more into the concrete and talk about actual rules. That's where we get interactive. So this URL will get you into a shared pad, a shared text editor, which you will be able to join. You should get the link as well. It should be clickable. And from there, you will find a template with all these 7 components. We will go through it. So each of us will choose one service that we'd like to analyze along this grid. It could be a service you operate and would like to become a common, or it could be an online service that you use and consider already to be commons-based, or it could be a service that you would really like to become a digital common. So to do it in real time, though, the best is that you take one service that you know already quite a bit. Otherwise, we might be a bit short on time. In any case, if you don't have the time to go through all components, no worries, you can always go back to this later. So please keep in mind that there is up to 30 seconds latency between my speech and you receiving it. So I might not always be perfectly in sync between what I'm saying and what you will see on this template if you are looking at my own changes. Please focus on yours and on the speech. I will, for myself, use Wikipedia as the service example that I will work with. I see that quite a few people are connected. Thank you very much for joining. Please make sure to fill in your name. We should all have different colors in the text editor. And you can start copying the template and pasting it after all the others. I will just give you a bit more time. Perfect. I see some changes appearing now. So please choose one service and I will get started now, allowing for some more time. Okay, I hope everybody at least has an idea of the service that they want to work with. Let's get started with my example of Wikipedia. So I will be doing Wikipedia. You can take any other. Let's focus first on the license that is applied on the source code. If I go on the Wikipedia website and try to understand a bit how it is built with, what it is built with, I will find the webpage for MediaWiki, which is the piece of open source software that enables these wiki-style encyclopedias, Wikipedia as well as many others. And if I go through the repository for this piece of software, I will find that it is published under GPL version 2 license. So what I suggest is that you always give the reference of this rule, the name of this rule in the template. So in my case, I have written rule GPL v2. And then there is another point that is called reference, in which I suggest that you give a URL, a link to the proof of this licensing. So not necessarily the link to the license itself in terms of the description of the license, but really a link that will show that this specific software, this specific service is made available under this license. If there are some specific questions, some uncertainties, feel free to use the notes part. So once again, I'm giving some time now due to the difference, to the delay. I see that some people have used CT login, messaging items. Yeah. So please take one specific service, one for which you can give a name. It could be OpenStreetMap, it could be one on which you are working. I see Public Lab. Perfect. Okay. I think I will go to the next component in about 1 minute, hoping that everyone has chosen their service and started finding the licenses. Perfect. Let's get going. If you haven't had the time to work on this first component, no worries. You can start already on the second one with the terms. So in the case of Wikipedia, we've seen that the source code component is made available under GPL v2 license, which does match the constraints that we outlined earlier, where the software should be made available under an open source license to ensure reusability and minimize risks of reappropriation. Let's now focus on the terms of service. Once again, if I go around Wikipedia, I examine the service, I might go down all the way to the footer and find terms of use, terms of service, which will redirect me to the Wikimedia Foundation terms of use. And there, I will find a nice recap, which says basically that I'm free to use the articles and the content in whichever way I see fit, as long as I don't use that to harm others, right, broadly speaking. As long as I take responsibility for what I am doing, as long as my contributions are made in a polite and civil way and lawful, as long as I do not try to prevent others from enjoying the service in the best way. So once again, I will just write that rule down, saying, for example, that the terms of use say no usage is free as long as it does not prevent others from using the service as well, and as long as it is civil and legal. And in the reference field, I will just give the link to these terms of use. So you should be doing the same for the service, the digital service that you have chosen. The terms of use are usually quite long documents, so if you are not very familiar with them already, it might be too short to do this during this workshop. It's totally fine if you just read through them quickly and add some notes, or if you simply put a link to the terms of use and go back later to give the recap. So in the case of Wikipedia, we've seen that there are no conditions other than protecting other users. usage of the tool. Let's go to data. In the case of Wikipedia, I will have, sorry, I just got some messages that I thought were directed to me, which were not. And so in the case of Wikipedia, once again, going through the terms of use, I will find that the data, that is the content of the articles, is made available under a dual license that enables reuse. It is made available under a Creative Commons license, CC BY, Creative Commons Attribution and Share Alike, and another license as well. So these two enable reuse. That means you could reuse the data that is made available in Wikipedia, even if you were not using the Wikipedia service, preventing this way reappropriation. I will also add in the notes that specific country instances of Wikipedia, such as Wikipedia France or India, can have more specific licenses, but they should always be compatible with these ones. So I will just write that down in the notes. Country-specific Wikipedias might have more specific licensing requirements. It would be common for most services to not necessarily distinguish between their data and their source code. If the data that enables delivering of value is delivered with the source code, they might very well be under the same license. The user-provided data might not necessarily be made available. Once again, this is fine. This whole framework is about assessing where we are at and understanding what would be the road ahead. So if your service does not provide data in a reusable format, just write that down. It's fine to say that there is no specific rule on that, even though not having specific rules means that the data is kept private to one specific actor, thereby preventing reusability. If you are the operator of such a service, then you know that it would be good to make that data available in order to foster reuse. All right. That was it with data. We've seen that in the case of Wikipedia, I've written that it's a dual license between Creative Commons Attribution and Share Alike and GFDL, which is a slightly less common license. Let's go now with the statistics of usage. That is how we observe the interaction between users and the service itself. Once again, if I explore a bit around the Wikipedia website, I will find stats.wikimedia.org, which actually, in quite a rare display, make visible and public their statistics. Not only do they make these dashboards publicly available, they also specifically mention that this data is made available under a CC0, that is public domain license. This is what I will write down now as a rule. And the reference will be, as usual, a link to the page that describes these terms of use. So it is very unlikely that the tools, the services you are assessing yourself will provide such statistics. In order to keep the time short, I suggest that we don't spend too much time on the statistics part and rather focus on either the data part that you were exploring before or the next ones. I will just give you a few more seconds to explore around, see if there's any statistics or usage data links in the footer of your public service, for example, but it is likely that you won't have such a tool. So we've seen that in the case of Wikipedia, the statistics of usage are made available for each instance of country-specific Wikipedias under a public domain CC0 license. Let's now focus on means for communication. How is representativity of the community achieved in the case of Wikipedia, or in your case, for your service? If I explore around, I will find that the Wikimedia Foundation holds elections for in their boards. So the representative of the community is achieved by holding regular elections that will ensure accountability and renewal of the people who have access to the means of communication. This happens both at the foundation level, that is the global entity, but also for each country, at each country level, for each individual Wikipedia. Indeed, there are NGOs that back most of the local country-specific instances of Wikipedia, in which cases it is legally binding for them to hold regular elections. So the representativity in the means of communication is achieved through elections. This is what I will write down now in the rules part. Representativity of community is achieved through holding regular elections. The elected representatives have access to the means of communication. And as a reference, I will give the link to the description of the election process. In the case of most services, it might be that one person is in charge of communication, maybe a social media manager. Do they act on behalf of one specific entity? How do they get information from the community around which communication should be sent? Is it about getting incoming feedback and then unilaterally deciding to take it into account or not? Is it about distributing means of access through tools that enable cross logins, that is enabling several people to log in through social media accounts, for example, and sending different messages? Is there a way for the community to veto or to support some messages to be sent? How do you decide how you will appear, how the service will appear externally and within the community? All these questions are extremely important to answer. So we've seen that in the case of Wikipedia, this happens through election of representatives. Let's talk now about the branding elements. There is a trademark policy for the Wikimedia Foundation that is very clear around what it allows and does not. The rule is basically that you are allowed to use the Wikipedia brand and all associated brands, which are copyrighted, as long as you use it to describe the Wikipedia project or link to information that is related to it. You might need a special authorization if you intend to use it for commercial stuff, such as merchandising. And finally, you might not use it to impersonate Wikipedia, unless for some specific exceptions, such as clearly labeled parody. So this is what I will write down now. The rule for the brand element is that there's a charter saying allowed to reuse for linking and truthfully reporting on Wikipedia, authorization needed for commercial uses, and forbidden for impersonation. And in the reference, just a link to the trademark policy. It is more likely that the services you will find and you are assessing now have some sort of policy around how to use their brand. If there is none, that means that some entity holds the copyright to the branding elements and might use that power unilaterally to prevent criticism or to shut down alternatives that would use their brand. It might also mean that it is not protected at all, meaning that some other entity might create a copy of this tool and of the other service, and it would be harder to correct the record for the general public. So I hope you found some branding requirements for your service. In the case of Wikipedia, we've seen that it is based in a license and charter for branding elements. Let's finish with the last component, the strategy. How are priorities decided? In the case of Wikipedia, there's one special page called the Village Pub, in which any editor might suggest proposals. Discussions might be led there, anyone can participate, and the whole process is entirely transparent. So this is how shared resources and how public decisions are made. On top of that, there are also resolutions, that is, big orientations that are voted by the board of the foundation, the one that has its members regularly re-elected, as we've seen in the communication component. And finally, local Wikipedia instances all have public accounting necessarily transparent out of their legal associative status. So that's how transparency in allocation of resources and community priorities are defined. This is what I will write down now as a rule. Resolutions voted by the board. Local instances have public accounting out of legal associative status, and proposals are made publicly. All right. So we've been through all the components now for Wikipedia, where we've seen how the community, how the proposals are managed by the community, and how the accounting is made public through the associative legal status. I hope you had enough time to go through and complete at least one or two components of the service you wanted to assess, and that you will maybe have more time to go through the ones that you are more curious about. This document will stay online for at least 30 days, and you're of course very welcome to make a copy of it and use it however you see fit. I will try to wrap up before we jump into the Q&A. So we've seen how digital commons are digital services with democratic governance applied across all of their components. This is a very operational point of view. I don't pretend that digital commons can be resumed to only these 7 components. But I believe that these are the ones on which the risk of reappropriation is important. And I've suggested constraints on the rules that would apply on all of these components. If you intend to create digital commons or want to foster them, you should pay attention to the rules that are applied on every one of these components, and hopefully change them over time to abide by the constraints that were given in the onset. Of course, if you are already operating a service, for example, a public service, you should not focus too much on getting all of that corrected straight away, because you won't have a digital common either if you don't have a service at all that doesn't work, because you've spent too much time on the governance itself. But as your usage grows, as you might have more and more visibility and potentially more competition or more risk, it is very important that you take into account these risks and mitigate them. Thank you very much for your attention. We can now go in the Q&A on Wonder. I think you will get the link in the chat. And if you want a reference for this framework, you can use commons.mathischneider.fr, which will give you this table recap that we went through. Thank you very much, and see you in the Q&A session.